Welcome back to Cursed Whispers. Tonight's story is inspired by real cases where entire families disappeared without warning. No signs of violence, no ransom, no bodies, just silence. The house stood in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind where routines never changed. Lights went out at the same time every night, cars left for work every morning. Neighbors waved politely and minded their own business. The family had lived there for years. 2 parents, 2 children, a dog. Nothing remarkable, nothing alarming. The first sign something was wrong wasn't dramatic. It was absence. The lights stayed on overnight. The dog barked for hours. Newspapers piled up on the porch. By the 3rd day, a neighbor called the police assuming someone was sick or injured. When officers entered the house, everything looked normal. Dinner plates sat on the table with food half eaten. A pot rested on the stove. Shoes were neatly lined by the door. Wallets and purses were exactly where they were always kept. Phones were plugged in, still charging. Passports untouched. No bags packed. No notes left behind. The family hadn't planned to leave. Bedrooms were unmade, as if everyone had simply stood up and walked away. The children's backpacks hung by the door. Their bicycles were still chained outside. Even the dog was still there, weak, dehydrated, but alive. There were no signs of forced entry, no blood, no fingerprints that didn't belong. It was as if the family vanished in the middle of an ordinary evening. Police initially classified the case as a voluntary disappearance. That theory collapsed quickly. Bank accounts were untouched, credit cards unused, phones inactive, social security numbers never accessed again, no travel records, no sightings. It was like they had been erased. Neighbors were interviewed one by one. Most reported nothing unusual. One neighbor hesitated. He said that in the nights leading up to the disappearance, he noticed someone standing across the street, always late, always watching the house, never moving. When asked to describe the person, he couldn't. He only said the presence felt wrong, like it didn't belong there. Detectives dismissed it. As the investigation continued, a disturbing pattern emerged. Similar cases had occurred in other states, different families, different homes, same outcome. Entire households gone without explanation. Every case had been quietly transferred to the same special investigative unit, not to solve them, to manage them. The house was eventually sold. New owners moved in. They reported an uneasy feeling at night, but nothing concrete. Life continued. The family was never found. Years later, a journalist requested access to the case file. At first, he was told the file had been misplaced, then that it had been archived. Finally, he was told it no longer existed. But something didn't make sense. While reviewing old property records, he noticed something strange. The house had changed owners 3 times since the disappearance. None of the new owners stayed longer than 6 months. Not because of noise, not because of fear, because investigators kept coming back, unannounced, always asking the same questions, always requesting the same rooms. One former owner later admitted something unsettling. He said that every time police returned, they weren't looking for evidence. They were checking if something had appeared. The journalist pushed further and discovered that the lead detective on the case had been reassigned weeks after the disappearance. Not fired, not promoted, moved to the same internal unit that quietly handled similar cases across the country. Different families, different homes, same silence. Before the journalist could publish his findings, his request was officially denied. The reason given was simple. The case was not classified as unsolved. It was classified as ongoing. And according to internal notes, it wasn't closed because the family might come back, but because someone was still watching the house. Some houses don't make people disappear. They make them unreachable. There is a difference between being missing and being removed. This is the story of a man who walked into his home one evening and was never officially seen again. But his house never stopped being watched. Welcome back to Cursed Whispers. Tonight's story follows a real missing person case tied to an aging residential property. A case that was quietly deprioritized despite clear signs something was wrong. No public closure, no confirmed outcome. Only a house that authorities kept returning to long after they said there was nothing left to find. The house stood on a narrow street, built long before zoning laws existed. It had changed owners multiple times over the decades. The man who lived there worked a stable job, no criminal record, no known enemies. Neighbors described him as quiet but present, someone who waved, someone who came home at the same time every night. Until one evening, he didn't. His car was found parked in the driveway, doors locked, lights still on inside. Food was left out in the kitchen. His phone was charging on the counter. There were no signs of a struggle, no forced entry, no blood. Police initially treated it as a voluntary disappearance, but the house told a different story. Investigators documented the scene, then stopped returning calls. Evidence was logged but never followed up. Certain rooms were photographed repeatedly, others barely noted. Neighbors noticed something unsettling. Unmarked cars returned months later, then again the following year. No announcements, no visible activity, just quiet checks, always brief, always focused on the same parts of the house. A relative pushed for answers. Through public records, they discovered something disturbing. The detective originally assigned to the case had been transferred, not removed, not disciplined, reassigned to a unit that handled similar disappearances in other regions. Different victims, different towns, same type of house. Older structures, long histories. Cases labeled as inactive, but never closed. Years later, the house was sold. The new owners reported investigators asking to verify conditions, not to search, not to investigate, just to confirm the layout hadn't changed. The missing man was never declared deceased, and the reason wasn't lack of evidence, it was timing. Because according to internal notes, this wasn't considered an isolated case. It was considered part of a sequence. And somewhere, someone is still waiting for the next house to match the pattern. There are murders that shock because of how violent they are. And then there are murders that disturb because of how long they remain unnoticed. Some houses don't hide bodies, they hide time. Welcome back to Cursed Whispers. Tonight's story is based on a real murder case connected to an old residential house. A case where the crime itself was not the most unsettling part. What followed was. The house was located in a quiet neighborhood, built decades before modern construction standards. It had thick walls, narrow staircases, and rooms that trapped sound. The owner was a middle-aged man who lived alone. No criminal history, no known conflicts. Neighbors described him as private but polite, someone who kept to himself. Which is why it took days before anyone noticed something was wrong. Mail began piling up, lights stayed on at night, no movement. When police entered the house, they didn't find signs of forced entry, they found a body. The man had been killed inside his own home. No weapon was immediately visible, no obvious struggle. The scene suggested he had known the person who entered. Investigators documented the crime and removed the body. And then something unusual happened. The house wasn't sealed for long. Within weeks, activity around the property resumed. Not renovations, not cleanup, visits. Unmarked vehicles returned late at night. Officers entered briefly, then left. Neighbors noticed the same rooms being accessed repeatedly. Not the bedroom, not the entryway, the basement. Records later showed that evidence from the basement was logged multiple times across different dates, but publicly the investigation stalled. No suspect was announced, no updates were released. The case quietly disappeared from local news. Years later, a retired officer spoke anonymously. He said the murder wasn't treated as an isolated incident. It was flagged because similar cases existed. Different houses, different victims, but the same pattern. Old homes, single occupants, crimes discovered late, and investigative units that returned long after the scene was cleared. According to internal notes, the concern wasn't only who committed the murder, it was whether the house itself had been used before. The property was sold. The new owners reported being asked unusual questions, not about the crime, about the structure, whether walls had been removed, whether the basement layout was unchanged. The murder case remains officially unsolved, not because leads ran out, but because it was absorbed into a larger review, one that never became public. And if you've been listening closely, you may notice something familiar. An old house, a delayed response, authorities returning not to investigate, but to verify. Because by the time the body was found, it wasn't the first time something had happened there. It was just the first time someone noticed. Some disappearances don't begin with panic. They begin quietly, almost politely, with paperwork, routine, and silence. Nothing dramatic happens at first. No alarms, no sudden realization, just the slow awareness that something ordinary has stopped. This is the story of a woman who vanished before most people even knew she was missing. Welcome back to Cursed Whispers. She was in her early 30s, lived alone, and followed a routine so predictable that neighbors barely noticed her anymore. Lights on at the same time every evening, curtains drawn the same way, trash taken out on the same day each week. Her house was old, built long before modern planning, with narrow hallways, uneven floors, and rooms that had been repurposed again and again over decades. People like that don't disappear suddenly, and that's why no one worried at first. When she didn't arrive at work that morning, coworkers assumed she was sick or running late. Hours passed. Messages went unanswered. Calls went to voicemail. By evening, concern finally replaced assumption. Police entered the house that night. Everything felt paused, not abandoned. Her phone was still on the table, screen dark but charged. Her keys were inside. Her bag hadn't moved. The door was locked. Nothing suggested she had packed or prepared to leave. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken glass, no overturned furniture, no marks of a struggle. To the public, the explanation was simple: a voluntary disappearance. Adults leave sometimes, lives change. Internally, the case was treated very differently. Before her name appeared on any official missing persons bulletin, investigators requested documents that had nothing to do with her personal life. They didn't ask about friends, relationships, or recent behavior. They asked for property records. Old ones. Architectural plans drawn decades earlier, records of renovations that had never been properly documented. They examined walls, foundations, sealed spaces, and areas that didn't appear on newer maps. Neighbors later described officers measuring distances inside the house, counting steps between rooms, and examining door frames. They focused on structural elements, not personal belongings. It didn't resemble a search for a missing person. It resembled an inspection. Within days, the investigation quietly shifted direction. A second address was added to the file, another old house several kilometers away. No public announcement explained why, no connection was acknowledged, but that second house had appeared before. Years earlier, it was linked to another disappearance, different victim, different time, same silence afterward. A person gone, a house left standing, files marked inactive but never closed. Internally, the cases were linked. Publicly, they never were. The woman was never declared deceased. No body was found. No official conclusion reached. Yet her name slowly disappeared from active missing persons listings. Journalists who later requested information were told the case was under ongoing review, a review that never seemed to end. A former analyst later described the logic behind it. They weren't trying to locate her anymore. They were confirming something, a consistency, a repetition. Because in cases like this, disappearance isn't treated as the event, it's treated as a signal. The house remains untouched to this day. No sale, no renovation, no demolition. Just occasional visits, quiet checks, and no explanations offered to anyone outside the file. And if you've been listening closely since the beginning of this season, you already understand why this matters. The disappearances, the murders, the delayed investigations, they aren't random, they form a sequence. And in the final story, you'll learn what that sequence was leading toward. Not a person, not a confession, but a method hidden in plain sight. Some crimes don't stand alone. They don't announce themselves. They wait. They wait quietly, spread across years, cities, and lives that never seem connected. At first glance, they look like isolated tragedies. A missing family, a man who never came home, a body discovered too late. Different places, different people, different stories. But patterns don't need to be loud to exist. Welcome back to Cursed Whispers. If you've listened to every story this season, you've already felt it. Something repeating, something familiar. Old houses, locked doors, delayed investigations. Authorities returning long after the public stopped asking questions. This final story is not about a single crime. It's about why none of them were ever meant to be solved. It started quietly, inside an internal review that was never supposed to happen. An analyst noticed similarities between cases that had been archived under different labels: missing persons, unsolved murders, family disappearances. On paper, they had nothing in common, but procedurally, they were identical. The same investigators reassigned without explanation, the same requests for architectural documents, the same focus on old residential structures. Not suspects, not motives, buildings. When the locations were mapped, something unsettling emerged. These houses weren't random. They shared characteristics that made them ideal for one thing: time. Thick walls, sealed basements, renovations lost to history, ownership records incomplete or missing entirely. Places where sound didn't travel, places where absence could be mistaken for privacy. Places where discovery came too late. In several cases, authorities arrived at secondary locations before crimes were publicly known. In others, witnesses were interviewed and then quietly excluded from follow-ups. Files were merged internally while remaining separate in public systems. This wasn't incompetence. It was design. The goal was never to identify a killer. There was no official serial profile because the crimes didn't rely on a single individual. What linked them wasn't who committed them. It was access. Access to spaces that allowed crimes to unfold unseen. Access to structures that protected silence. Access to time. One internal memo described the strategy as procedural containment. Once a case matched the pattern, it stopped being an investigation and became a monitoring operation. Certain houses were flagged, demolition permits quietly delayed, sales discouraged without explanation. In one documented case, a house scheduled for demolition was removed from the list days before machinery arrived. No public reason was given. The structure still stands today. Not because it's historic, because it's unresolved. Families were never told the full truth. They were given fragments, delays, administrative language, words like inactive and pending review. Not lies, just enough truth to prevent questions. And here is the most disturbing part. The pattern didn't end. The most recent case connected to this sequence is still open. Not cold, not unsolved. Ongoing. Which means the procedures are still active, the houses are still being watched, and the system is still waiting. Not for justice, not for closure, for repetition. Because when a system learns it can survive silence, it doesn't correct itself, it adapts. And in this story, the most terrifying truth isn't who committed the crimes, it's who decided they didn't need to be solved.